The spring air still smelled of smoke and gunpowder across Bavaria. It was late April 1945, and everyone knew the war was ending. The German Reich was falling apart like a house made of cards. American tanks rolled through towns where white flags hung from windows. Soldiers who had fought for Hitler now hid in cellars or ran toward the Western Front, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Russians. Master Sergeant Frank Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead as his jeep bounced along a dirt road. His unit had been pushing through southern Germany for weeks. They were tired. They were hungry. But they were alive, and that was more than many could say. Morrison was 32 years old, a farmer from Iowa before the war. He had kind eyes but hard hands, the kind that came from both plowing fields and fighting battles. His driver, a young private named Eddie Collins, pointed ahead. "Sarge, you see that smoke?" Morrison squinted. 3 columns of white smoke rose from behind a hill. Not the black smoke of burning buildings. This was different. Chimney smoke. Cooking smoke. Could be civilians, Morrison said, but his hand moved to his rifle anyway. In war, you never knew. They drove closer, and the compound came into view. It was a large German military kitchen facility, surrounded by a wooden fence. Several buildings stood in neat rows, their chimneys puffing steadily. A German flag still hung from a pole, though it drooped sadly in the windless air. 2 transport trucks sat abandoned near the gate. Morrison signaled his men to spread out. 12 soldiers moved quietly, weapons ready. They had learned not to trust quiet places. Sometimes quiet places hid dangers, but when they kicked open the kitchen door, they found no danger. They found 12 German men in stained white aprons, hands already reaching for the ceiling. The men were not young soldiers with fire in their eyes. They were older men, fathers and grandfathers, with tired faces and gray hair. These were cooks, not fighters. The oldest one stepped forward slowly. His apron had grease stains and his hands shook. "Bit," he said in German, then tried English. "Please. We surrender. No weapons." Morrison lowered his rifle slightly. He had seen thousands of prisoners during the war, but something about these men felt different. They looked relieved, not afraid, like they had been waiting for this moment. "Search them," Morrison ordered. His men patted down each cook carefully. They found no guns, no grenades. Only kitchen knives and wooden spoons. Through a translator, Morrison learned the head cook's name was Klaus Weber. Klaus was 53 years old and had been drafted into the German army 2 years ago. His job was simple: cook food for troops. He had never fired a gun in the war. He had only stirred pots and baked bread. "Where are the soldiers you feed?" Morrison asked. Klaus shook his head. "Gone. They left 3 days ago. Retreating east. They told us to wait here, but nobody came back." Morrison walked through the compound with Klaus following nervously behind. The kitchen was well stocked. Sacks of potatoes lined one wall. Shelves held canned vegetables and dried beans. In the cold storage, there were even some vegetables and bread. This place had enough food to feed an army, but the army was gone. As they walked outside, Morrison heard voices. Quiet, fearful voices coming from the buildings nearby. He turned sharply. "Who else is here?" Klaus hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Displaced people. They hide here. When the troops left, they came. They have nowhere to go." Morrison's men searched the surrounding buildings. What they found made Morrison's chest tighten. In one building, they found 15 French prisoners of war. Their uniforms were torn and their faces were hollow from hunger. These men had been captured years ago and forced to work in German factories. When the factories closed, they were abandoned. In another building, they found Polish laborers, men and women who had been brought to Germany to work in fields and factories. They were too afraid to go home because the Russians were coming from the east, and they did not know if their homes even existed anymore. In a third building, Morrison found German civilians, mothers with children, old men who could barely walk. They were refugees fleeing from the east, running from the Soviet advance. They had heard terrible stories about what Russian soldiers did in revenge for what Germans had done in Russia. Morrison stood in the center of the compound, looking around at all these people. French prisoners glared at German civilians. Polish workers kept their distance from everyone. The German cooks stood together, unsure what would happen to them. Everyone was hungry. Everyone was scared. Everyone was wondering what the Americans would do. Eddie Collins came up beside Morrison. "What now, Sarge? Do we take the cooks as prisoners?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his farm back in Iowa. He thought about his wife and 2 daughters waiting for him. He thought about all the death he had seen in this war. He thought about the newsreels he had watched before shipping out, showing the concentration camps the Allies had liberated, the walking skeletons, the mass graves, the evil that men could do. But he also thought about something his father had told him before he left for war. "Frank," his father had said, "war will try to make you forget you are human. Do not let it." Morrison looked at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimneys. He looked at the scared faces watching him. He looked at Klaus Weber, who stood with his hands still half raised, waiting for judgment. Then Morrison made a decision. It was not the military decision. It was not the safe decision. But it was the human decision. He turned to his radio operator. "Get Lieutenant Harris on the line. Tell him we have a situation here, and we are going to need more supplies." Eddie looked confused. "Supplies, Sarge? For what?" Morrison looked at all the hungry people around the compound. "We are going to feed them," he said quietly. "We are going to feed all of them." Klaus Weber did not understand English well, but he understood the tone in Morrison's voice. Something was about to change. He just did not know what yet. The evening sun cast long shadows across the compound. Klaus Weber sat on a wooden crate outside the kitchen, watching American soldiers move around with purpose. His fellow cooks huddled nearby, whispering nervously in German. They had been captured for 6 hours now, but still nobody had taken them away. This was strange. Usually prisoners were moved quickly. Otto Schneider, the youngest cook at 28, kept wringing his hands. "What are they waiting for?" he whispered to Klaus. "Why do they keep us here?" Klaus had no answer. In his 2 years serving the German army, he had heard many stories about what happened to captured soldiers. Some said Americans treated prisoners well. Others said different things. Klaus did not know what to believe anymore. The war had made truth as rare as fresh meat. Through the kitchen window, Klaus could see Morrison talking on a field radio. The American sergeant's face was serious but calm. He was not the monster the German newspapers had described. He was just a tired man in a dirty uniform, trying to make decisions in a broken world. Finally, Morrison finished his radio call. He walked toward the cooks with his translator, a thin corporal named Jimmy Chun who spoke perfect German. His family had come from Germany to America before the First World War. The cooks stood up quickly, their hearts racing. This was it. This was when they would learn their fate. Morrison stopped in front of Klaus. Through Chun, he asked, "Can this kitchen operate? Can you cook large amounts of food?" Klaus blinked in confusion. "Yes, sir. We cooked for 300 soldiers every day. The equipment works. We have supplies." Morrison nodded slowly. "Good. Here is what will happen. You will continue to cook, but not for German soldiers. Those days are over." Klaus felt dizzy. Continue to cook? As prisoners? This made no sense. Morrison continued. "You will cook for everyone in this area. The French prisoners, the Polish workers, the German civilians, all the displaced people who have nowhere to go and nothing to eat. You will feed them. Do you understand?" The words came through the translator, but Klaus could not believe them. He looked at Chun. "I am sorry, could you repeat that?" Chun repeated the order in careful German. Klaus felt his mouth go dry. Around him, his fellow cooks began whispering frantically. This was impossible. This was not how war worked. Victors did not feed the defeated. Enemies did not show mercy. The strong took from the weak. That was the way of the world. Otto spoke up, his voice shaking. "Even the French? Even the prisoners who were kept here against their will?" Morrison looked directly at Otto, and Chun translated his answer. "I said everyone. That means everyone who is hungry. I do not care what country they are from. I do not care what uniform they wore. I do not care what they did or did not do. They are hungry. You will feed them." Another cook, an older man named Ernst, asked the question they were all thinking. "But sir, we are Germans." They are. They are people we were told to hate. The French fought against us. The Poles." Morrison raised his hand, stopping Ernst mid-sentence. His voice became firm. "The war is over. Maybe not officially, but it is over. Germany has lost. The Reich has fallen. All those orders about who to hate, they mean nothing now. What matters is that there are hungry people here, and there is food here, and you know how to turn that food into meals. That is all that matters." Klaus sat back down heavily on his crate. His mind spun. For years, he had followed orders without question. Cook for German soldiers. Support the war effort. Do not question. Do not think. Just obey. Now an American soldier was giving him a different order, and it broke everything Klaus thought he understood about war. What if we refuse? Ernst asked quietly. Morrison's answer came quick and cold. Then you will be sent to a prisoner camp, and I will find other cooks. But I think you are better men than that. I think you know that feeding hungry people is not wrong, no matter who those people are. Chun translated, but the silence that followed needed no translation. Finally, Klaus stood up again. He looked Morrison in the eye. We will do it, he said in broken English, then added in German for his fellow cooks. We will do this thing. The other cooks stared at him. Otto looked like he might be sick. Ernst shook his head slowly. But one by one, they nodded. What choice did they have? They were prisoners. They followed orders. That was what they knew. But as Morrison walked away, Klaus realized something. This order felt different. Following this order did not feel like being a prisoner. It felt like being given a chance to be human again. That night, Morrison assigned guards to watch the kitchen. But he did not assign them to keep the cooks from escaping. He assigned them to help. 2 American soldiers, both farm boys like Morrison, helped Klaus and his team prepare for the next day. Private Eddie Collins carried heavy sacks of potatoes. Another soldier, named Mike Torres, helped haul water for the cooking pots. They did not speak German, and the cooks barely spoke English, but they worked together in the way men do when there is work to be done. As midnight approached, Klaus stood outside the kitchen. The stars were bright above Bavaria. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still rumbled, but it was far away now. The war was moving east, chasing the last remnants of Hitler's broken army. Eddie Collins came out for a cigarette. He offered one to Klaus, who took it gratefully. They smoked together in silence for a moment. Why? Klaus finally asked in simple English. Why you do this? Eddie took a long drag from his cigarette. He struggled to find words Klaus would understand. Finally, he pointed at the building where the French prisoners slept, then at the building with Polish workers, then at the German civilians, then at Klaus. All same, Eddie said slowly. All hungry. All people. Klaus felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them away. He was too old and too tired to cry. But Eddie's simple words hit harder than any artillery shell. Tomorrow, Klaus said, we cook good food. Very good. Eddie smiled. That is all we ask, friend. That is all we ask. Neither man knew it then, but they were standing at the beginning of something bigger than both of them. Dawn broke cold and gray over the compound. Klaus had not slept. He and his team had worked through the night, preparing what might be the strangest meal any of them had ever cooked. They made potato soup with vegetables. They baked bread using the last of their flour. They prepared a thin but nourishing stew with beans and small pieces of preserved meat. It was simple food, but it was real food, and there was enough for everyone. At 6 in the morning, Morrison's soldiers began spreading word through the area. There would be food. There would be a meal. Everyone was welcome. Klaus watched through the kitchen window as people began to arrive. They came slowly at first, unsure if this was real or some kind of cruel trick. The war had taught everyone to distrust good news. The French prisoners came first. 15 men in tattered uniforms, their bodies thin from years of poor rations. They had been captured in 1940 during the fall of France, 5 years ago. 5 years of forced labor in German factories. 5 years of barely surviving. Their leader was a man named Antoine Rousseau, who had been a baker in Paris before the war. He walked at the front of the group, his head held high despite everything. Behind the French came the Polish workers. 23 people, including 6 women. They had been brought to Germany in 1942 to work in ammunition factories. When the factories were bombed, they were sent to work in fields. They had nowhere to return to. The Soviet army now occupied Poland, and nobody knew what kind of country it would become. Then came the German civilians. Mothers carrying children. Old men with haunted eyes. Families who had fled from the east, running from the advancing Red Army. They had heard the stories from refugees who came before them. Stories of revenge and rage. Stories of what Russian soldiers did to German towns in payment for what German soldiers had done in Russia. That Morrison's soldiers organized everyone into lines. Private Eddie Collins shouted instructions, pointing people where to stand. There was no segregation, no separation. A French prisoner stood next to a German mother with her child. A Polish man waited behind an elderly German couple who could barely stand. Klaus watched all this from his position behind the serving table. His hands trembled as he gripped a large ladle. Beside him, Otto was pale and sweating. Ernst kept muttering prayers under his breath. "This is madness," Otto whispered in German. "We are feeding the enemy." Klaus said nothing. He was not sure what to think anymore. The first person in line was Antoine, the French baker. He stepped up to Klaus with a metal bowl in his hands. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. Klaus had cooked food for the soldiers who had kept this man prisoner. Klaus had been part of the machine that had stolen 5 years of Antoine's life. "I am sorry," Klaus said quietly in German, not knowing if Antoine would understand. That Antoine's eyes widened. He understood the tone, if not the words. He nodded slowly. Klaus filled the bowl with hot soup. His hands shook so badly that some spilled. He added a thick slice of bread. Antoine took the bowl, and his eyes filled with tears. Real tears that rolled down his thin face. "Merci," Antoine whispered. "Thank you." Klaus felt something break inside his chest. It was not pain exactly. It was something else. Something he had not felt in years. It might have been shame. It might have been relief. It might have been the first small seed of hope. The line moved forward. One by one, Klaus served them all. He served the French prisoners who looked at him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. He served the Polish workers who said nothing but nodded thanks. He served the German civilians who were too proud to meet his eyes but too hungry to refuse the food. After 30 minutes, Otto suddenly stopped serving. He put down his ladle and walked away from the table. Klaus heard him behind the kitchen, crying. The young cook had broken down completely. Klaus stepped over to cover Otto's position. He kept serving. He kept ladling soup and handing out bread. His arms ached, but he did not stop. Morrison watched all of this from near the fence. Eddie Collins came up beside him. "Some of the guys are asking questions, Sarge," Eddie said quietly. "They want to know why we are feeding German civilians when we are still fighting German soldiers 50 miles east." Morrison was quiet for a moment. He watched an old German woman receive her bowl of soup. She reminded him of his own mother back in Iowa. "What do you think, Eddie?" Morrison finally asked. Eddie shrugged. "I think those people did not drop bombs on London. I think that mother with the baby did not shoot at us in Normandy. I think most of these folks just wanted to live their lives, and war happened to them like a storm they could not control." Morrison nodded. "That is what I think too. My job is to fight soldiers. But these people are not soldiers. They are just people trying to survive." By mid-morning, something remarkable began to happen. Antoine, the French baker, noticed Klaus struggling to keep up with the serving line. Without a word, Antoine walked behind the table and picked up Otto's abandoned ladle. He began serving soup alongside Klaus. Klaus stared at him in shock. Antoine just smiled sadly and kept serving. Then one of the Polish women, a tired-looking mother named Maria, began organizing the children. She got them to help wash the empty bowls so they could be used again. German children worked alongside Polish children, all of them following Maria's gentle instructions. By afternoon, the lines had faded. People sat in small groups, eating slowly, making the food last. Some talked quietly. Most just sat in silence, grateful to have something warm in their bellies. Klaus finally allowed himself to rest. He sat on his crate outside the kitchen, exhausted. Antoine came and sat beside him. They could not speak each other's language well, but Antoine pulled out a battered photograph. It showed a woman and 2 children. "Family," Antoine said in broken German. "Paris. I hope still alive." Klaus pulled out his own photograph. His wife and 3 daughters. "Hamburg," Klaus said. "I do not know if they are okay." The 2 men sat together, 2 fathers who had been on opposite sides of a terrible war, both just hoping their families had survived. Morrison watched them from across the compound. Eddie stood beside him. "You did a good thing today, Sarge," Eddie said. Morrison shook his head. "I just gave an order." They did the good thing. They chose to see each other as humans instead of enemies. As the sun set on that first day, everyone in the compound went to sleep with full stomachs for the first time in weeks. It was a small thing in a world torn apart by war. But sometimes, small things matter most. 3 days had passed since the first meal. The kitchen operation had become a strange little community where former enemies worked side by side. But not everyone was happy about it. That on the 4th morning, Morrison faced his first real challenge. A jeep roared into the compound, carrying Captain Raymond Fletcher, a career officer from Mississippi. Fletcher was known for being tough and by the book. He did not like surprises, and Morrison's kitchen operation was definitely a surprise. Fletcher climbed out of his jeep and looked around the compound with hard eyes. He saw German cooks working alongside French prisoners. He saw Polish women organizing supplies. He saw German civilians eating at the same tables as the people Germany had oppressed. Sergeant Morrison, Fletcher's voice was cold. What exactly is happening here? Morrison snapped a salute. Sir, we are providing humanitarian aid to displaced persons in the area. Fletcher walked slowly around the compound, his boots crunching on gravel. He stopped at the serving line where Klaus was ladling soup. Behind Klaus, Antoine was slicing bread. They worked together with the ease of men who had been partners for years, not enemies for days. These are German army cooks, Fletcher said flatly. They should be in a POW camp. Yes, sir. I intend to process them properly. But in the meantime, they are helping us manage a humanitarian crisis. Fletcher turned to face Morrison. And these? He pointed at the German civilians eating breakfast. Why are we feeding Germans when American supply lines are stretched thin? Morrison had expected this question. He had been preparing his answer for 3 days. Sir, those are non-combatants. Refugees. Women and children mostly. They are fleeing the Soviet advance. They are Germans, Sergeant. Let the Germans take care of Germans. There is no Germany anymore, sir. Morrison kept his voice respectful but firm. The Reich is collapsing. There is no government, no infrastructure. These people have nowhere to go. Fletcher's jaw tightened. I have soldiers under my command who went without hot meals so we could push through German lines. Boys from Tennessee and Georgia who ate cold rations in the rain. Now you want me to approve using our supplies to feed the enemy. Not the enemy, sir. Just hungry people. The two men stared at each other. Around them, the compound had gone quiet. People sensed the tension even if they could not understand the English words. Fletcher finally spoke. I will give you 3 more days, Morrison. Then these cooks go to a POW camp, and these refugees go to a proper relief station. We are not a charity. We are an army. 3 days. He climbed back into his Jeep and drove away, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Eddie Collins came up beside Morrison. That could have gone worse, Sarge. Could have gone better too. Morrison replied quietly, but the challenges did not come only from Morrison's own side. That afternoon, trouble erupted among the German civilians. An old man named Heinrich Vogel stood up during the lunch service and threw his bowl on the ground. He was perhaps 70 years old, thin and gray, but his voice was still strong. This is shameful, he shouted in German. I was an officer in the First War. I fought for the Kaiser. Now I must take charity from the enemy and eat beside Polish dogs. The compound went silent. Maria, the Polish woman who had been helping organize the children, stood frozen with hurt in her eyes. Klaus stepped forward. Heinrich, please sit down. We are all just trying to survive. Survive? Heinrich's face was red with rage. Look at us. Germans eating with prisoners. Sharing tables with the people who wanted us dead. Have we no pride left? Several other German civilians looked uncomfortable. Some nodded slightly in agreement. The poison of the Nazi years ran deep. You could not wash it away with one pot of soup. Morrison did not understand the German words, but he understood the tone. He started walking toward Heinrich, but Antoine was faster. The French baker moved to stand beside Maria. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. Then he turned to face Heinrich and spoke in careful German. Old man, I was captured in 1940. For 5 years, I worked in German factories. I was beaten. I was starved. I watched friends die. I had many reasons to hate. Antoine's voice was quiet but clear. But this woman, he gestured to Maria, she helped my son yesterday when he was crying. She did not care that I am French. She just saw a child who needed help. That is what humans do. That is what we have forgotten. Heinrich stared at Antoine. Some of the anger faded from his face, replaced by something else. Shame, maybe. Or just exhaustion. Klaus walked over and picked up Heinrich's bowl. He refilled it with soup and handed it back. We are all tired, Heinrich. We have all lost things. But we are alive. Let us be grateful for that. Heinrich took the bowl with shaking hands. He sat down slowly and ate in silence. That evening, Morrison found Klaus sitting alone outside the kitchen. The sergeant had brought 2 cups of weak coffee, a rare treasure. He sat down beside the German cook and handed him one. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set. Finally, Morrison spoke in slow, simple English that Klaus could mostly understand. Hard day. Klaus nodded. Yes, very hard. Why you do this? Morrison asked. You could refuse. Go to prison camp. Be done with it. Klaus thought for a long moment, searching for English words. Finally, he gave up and spoke in German. Morrison's translator, Jimmy Chun, was nearby and came over to help. Through Chun, Klaus said, "For 2 years, I cooked food for soldiers. I helped the war machine. I did not pull triggers, but I helped feed the men who did. I cannot undo that. But maybe, if I feed these people now, it is something. Not forgiveness. I do not deserve that. But maybe it is something small that is not evil." Morrison listened to the translation and nodded slowly. "You are a good man, Klaus. This war tried to make you into something else, but you are still a good man." Klaus felt tears in his eyes again. He seemed to cry more in these 4 days than in the previous 2 years. That night, as the compound settled into sleep, Antoine sat with Maria and some of the Polish workers. They shared stories in a mixture of languages, using hands and expressions when words failed. Some German children listened nearby, curious about these foreigners who had been called enemies. Otto, the young German cook, sat with them too. He had stopped crying and started listening. He was learning that the people he had been told to hate were just people after all. In his tent, Morrison wrote a letter to his wife back in Iowa. He did not mention the battles or the death. He wrote about a kitchen in Bavaria where people were learning to be human again. He ended the letter. Maybe this is what victory really looks like. Not flags and parades, but people sharing a meal and remembering how to be kind. He sealed the letter and hoped it would reach home before he did. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was officially over. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Thousand-Year Reich had lasted 12 years and ended in total destruction. Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. Church bells rang across Europe, from London to Paris to Moscow. The nightmare was finished. At the compound in Bavaria, the news came through Morrison's radio. When Jimmy Chun translated the announcement, nobody cheered. The war had taken too much from everyone there. They were too tired for celebration. They just felt relief, deep and heavy like a weight lifting from their shoulders. Morrison received his orders 2 days later. His unit was moving out. They were needed to help with occupation duties and processing prisoners of war. The kitchen operation would be handed over to a civilian relief organization that was moving through the area. The International Red Cross would take responsibility for all the displaced persons. On his last morning at the compound, Morrison walked through one final time. The place had changed in 2 weeks. What had been a place of fear and suspicion was now something different. Not quite friendship, but something close. Understanding, maybe. A recognition of shared humanity. Klaus met him outside the kitchen. The German cook had gained a little weight. His face looked less haunted. Behind him, Antoine was teaching Otto how to make proper French bread. The young German cook listened carefully, asking questions through hand gestures and broken phrases. "You go," Klaus said in simple English. He had learned a little bit over the 2 weeks. "Yes, my orders came. We leave today." Klaus reached into his apron and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it, he had written an address in Hamburg. "My family. If you go there, if they alive, tell them Klaus is alive too." Morrison took the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I will try. I promise I will try." The two men shook hands. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. A German and an American, once enemies, now just two men who had shared a strange moment of peace in the middle of chaos. "Thank you," Klaus said. "You show me, humans again. Not enemies. Humans." Morrison nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. As his unit's trucks rolled out of the compound, Morrison looked back one last time. Klaus stood at the gate, hand raised in farewell. Beside him stood Antoine, Maria, Otto, Ernst, and a dozen others. Former enemies standing together, watching American soldiers leave. Eddie Collins, driving the Jeep, glanced at Morrison. "Think they will be okay, Sarge?" "I think they will survive," Morrison said. "That is all anyone can do now. Survive and rebuild." The years passed. Morrison returned to his farm in Iowa. He planted corn and raised his daughters and tried not to dream about the war. He did find Klaus's family in Hamburg in 1946. The city was destroyed, but his wife and daughters had survived in a shelter. Morrison delivered Klaus's message personally. The wife cried and hugged him. This American soldier who brought news that her husband was alive. Klaus stayed in Bavaria. The Red Cross eventually released him and his fellow cooks from prisoner status. He found work at a civilian restaurant in Munich. The city was rubble and ruins, but people still needed to eat. He cooked simple meals for people trying to rebuild their lives. In 1947, Antoine found Klaus at the restaurant. The French baker had finally made it home to Paris, found his family alive, and then decided to come back to Bavaria. He said Paris had too many bad memories. He wanted to start fresh somewhere new. "You need cook?" Antoine asked in broken German. Klaus hired him on the spot. By 1950, they had opened their own small restaurant together. It was nothing fancy, just simple food served with care. But word spread. The quality was good, and the price was fair. Polish workers who had stayed in Germany came to eat there. Former German soldiers came. French occupation troops came. Everyone was welcome. In 1962, Klaus sat at a desk in the back of his restaurant. It was bigger now. The post-war years had been hard, but Germany was rebuilding. The economic miracle, they called it. His restaurant had grown. Otto worked there too, now the head chef. Maria, the Polish woman, had married Otto. They lived upstairs with their 3 children. Klaus picked up a pen and began writing a letter. He wrote in careful English, using a dictionary to check his words. The letter was addressed to Master Sergeant Frank Morrison, Iowa, United States. It had taken him years to track down the address. Writing to veteran organizations and military offices, he wrote about what happened after Morrison left, about Antoine returning, about the restaurant they built together, about Otto and Maria, about all the lives that had been changed by one simple order on one spring day in 1945 that he wrote. "You told us to feed everyone, just everyone. You did not care about nations or uniforms or old hates, just hungry people who needed food. That order changed my life. It showed me that being human is more important than being German or French or Polish or American. I try to live by that lesson every day." Klaus sealed the letter and included a photograph. It showed the front of his restaurant. Above the door was a sign in both German and English. "Everyone's kitchen." The letter traveled across the ocean and arrived at Morrison's farm 3 weeks later. Morrison sat on his porch and read it twice. Then he showed it to his wife, his eyes wet. "What did you do in the war, Dad?" his teenage son asked him that evening. Morrison thought for a long moment. He could tell stories about battles and danger, about landing at Normandy or pushing through France, about fear and death and all the terrible things he witnessed. But instead, he told his son about a kitchen in Bavaria, about a group of German cooks and French prisoners and Polish workers and American soldiers who all learned to see each other as humans instead of enemies, about a simple order to feed hungry people. "That was your greatest moment?" his son asked, sounding a little disappointed. He wanted to hear about heroism and bravery. Morrison smiled. "Yes, that was when I was most proud to wear my uniform. Not when I fired my weapon, but when I told those cooks to feed everyone. When I remembered that war does not erase our humanity. It just tests it." He kept Klaus's letter in his desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night when the memories of the war came back, Morrison would read it again. It reminded him that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness could change lives. In Munich, Klaus continued cooking. Every day, people from all walks of life came to eat at his restaurant. Some were German. Some were former prisoners who had stayed in Germany. Some were tourists. Some were young people who had no memory of the war. Klaus served them all the same, with the same care, the same dignity, because he had learned that everyone means everyone. And that lesson, born in a moment of mercy during humanity's darkest hour, was worth remembering forever.